Coming out of the closet and living openly as a member of the LGBTI+ community can be a psychological, emotional and social challenge. And until just 40 years ago, it was also a legal one. In 1982, the age of consent was lowered from 21 to 18 for homosexuals in France, making it the same for everyone. A landmark law that paved the way for important civil liberties, including the legalisation of same-sex marriage in 2013. However, there are still obstacles to overcome. Hello and welcome to this week's France in Focus, where we're looking at progress over the last 4 decades when it comes to LGBTI+ rights. One man's story spans some of the key moments in the history of that struggle. Bernard Bousset grew up in an era when homophobia was a constant menace, and laws at the time meant that he was even arrested and brought before the judge. Our reporters went to meet him.
He's more than just a recognisable face in the Marais, the heart of Paris's gay scene. Bernard Bousset has managed several venues, like this popular bar. But while he's crafted a successful career for himself, Bernard is still scarred by his painful past. He grew up in the small town of Dax, in the southwest of France.
Donc c'était le fils du président directeur général du casino.
My boyfriend was the son of the head of Dax's casino.
Il faisait du cheval et nous avec les filles.
His father also managed the prestigious hotels in town. He used to go horse riding, so together with the girls we'd go and watch him after class. It was nice for a few months, but before long people called us pansies in the street. I didn't dare go out anymore. One day we found him with a broken arm and a fractured jaw. That was the last time I saw him, and I'd become a target, so I was scared.
After finishing his studies, he left the city for a job in Bordeaux and went to underground gay bars, not without some risk.
Il y avait des descentes de police, des rafles, on appelait ça des rafles.
There were police raids. We called them roundups. They arrived in police vans and hauled us all in. They took us in for 2 days. I spent 2 days in custody in Bordeaux with just a bowl of soup and some bread, sleeping on a slab of concrete. When they let us out on the Tuesday morning, they called our family and our boss at work. At that point, we knew we were screwed.
Bernard's next move was to Saint-Tropez and then Megève in the Alps. There, he went home one evening with an 18-year-old. At the time, the age of consent for same-sex couples was 21. His partner later reported him to the police and he was convicted. Settling in Paris in the 70s, Bernard had a stable job and long-term relationship. A major milestone came when François Mitterrand was elected president in 1981 and levelled the age of consent for both homo and heterosexuals.
C'est sûr que toute la communauté gay a voté pour Mitterrand. Et je m'en souviendrai toujours.
Everyone from the gay community voted for him. I'll always remember the day they announced that Mitterrand had won. I was out at a nightclub and at 8 p.m. rose petals dropped from the ceiling onto the dance floor. Everyone was happy. All of a sudden, you felt free.
But despite growing acceptance and the rise of gay pride in France, the joy wasn't to last, as AIDS gradually spread across the world.
On ne savait pas comment la maladie s'attrapait vraiment.
No one really knew how it was transmitted, and only homosexual people were affected by it, so we were pariahs.
Faudrait que je retrouve, j'ai un vieux carnet, je l'ai cherché, j'ai pas.
I need to find an old address book to show you. I didn't want to cross out my friends' names, so I put a cross next to the names of those who died. There must be 40 of them in there.
Among the victims was Bernard's brother, as well as his boyfriend. Today, the bar owner is trying to take a step back from his busy life, but it's not so easy.
I'm ashamed. Still ashamed of being gay. Even though I'm 80. I've had a house in Normandy for 30 years. And I don't know anyone there, because I'm too ashamed.
To tell us more about the ongoing fight for equal rights, I'm joined by Sébastien Tüller from Amnesty International France. Sébastien, thanks for joining us.
Merci à vous.
Now let's start here with French politics. President Emmanuel Macron and his government put forward a plan to promote equal rights last year, saying that police officers should be better trained to deal with the victims of discrimination. Do you think that measure goes far enough?
It's essential to better train the police to fight against homophobia and transphobia, because there are still challenges when reporting a crime and when defining its homophobic or transphobic nature. In many cases, the aggravating element is hardly taken into account during legal proceedings, and there end up being very few convictions considering the growing number of victims in France. So it's essential to improve training to fight against impunity. Now, it can't stop at the police. The whole of society needs to be better trained, because there are still areas where we need to go forward and break down stereotypes and prejudices in regard to sexual orientation and gender identity.
The recent pandemic had a serious impact on many members of the community, especially young people and teenagers. And during the lockdowns, some were rejected by their families, even made homeless. What do you think this says about the state of their rights and the protections in place for them?
Human rights in general shouldn't be taken for granted. And it's clear that even if we're witnessing an improvement in LGBT rights across the globe for several years now, we're also seeing stagnation and even regression. COVID has amplified inequalities and discrimination. Young people in the LGBT community were the target of or victims of domestic violence during this crisis. So yeah, that pushes us to be mobilized and to continue our daily fight against LGBT discrimination.
And what about the differences for men and women? For example, recent legislation here in France allows for the medically assisted procreation, that is for females, but surrogacy is not legal. Do you think there's a united front when it comes to this ongoing fight for equal rights, regardless of gender?
I think lesbian women are victims of intersectional discrimination because they're subjected to both homophobia and sexism. We saw that throughout the bioethics debate on adopting the law for medically assisted procreation. Those who were the most concerned, lesbian women, were hardly given a say. Moreover, it was voted as a bioethics law, even though the question of medically assisted procreation for lesbian women or single women is not an ethical one. It's a question of equal rights. The law that was voted on was imperfect. Trans men are excluded from it, and how family names are passed on from one generation to the next remains biased. There's still a long way to go in terms of equality.
We see that stigma and sometimes outright homophobia can start early at school, in the playground. What role would you say that social media plays today?
Social media is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it allows for a proliferation of hate speech and homophobic and transphobic speech. This hate speech and toxic speech harms freedom of speech and leads many people to censor themselves out of fear of being targeted by insults and online harassment. This kind of hate speech targets particularly women and minorities like the LGBT community. But on the other hand, social media also creates solidarity networks. They help to make different sexual orientations and gender identities more visible. They also allow for mobilization, calling out homophobic and transphobic aggression, giving it more visibility. There are several victims of homophobic and transphobic violence who no longer feel ashamed to share their story and push authorities to take measures to allow us to live in a world of dignity and equality. We're not born homophobic or transphobic. We become those things. So it's important from an early age that we teach understanding for all the different sexual orientations and gender identities. That way we can live with dignity and equality in France.
Sébastien, thank you very much for joining us today.
Merci à vous.
For some, the internet's yet another source of harassment and intimidation. But it can also provide a platform for solidarity, help and support. Associations and activists use social media for outreach, and individuals can have a big impact too. One high school teacher in Clermont-Ferrand in central France came out professionally on TikTok in June 2021. Timote Curado uses the app to fight homophobia online and in the classroom, and now has over 950,000 followers. Our reporters went to meet him and some of his students.
He's a science teacher whose message goes far beyond the whiteboard. Timote Curado has close to 1 million followers on TikTok, where he came out to his students and followers. His profile is a rare one, an openly gay teacher with a knack for posting punchy stories and supporting students.
There are a lot of teenagers struggling to find their place, struggling to find answers to all their questions. With my videos, I hope to show them how we can be who we are without bothering about what others think.
Today, he's filming a news story, knocking back criticism with his usual light touch. It was only a decade ago that France first brought sexual orientation onto the sex ed curriculum. At the time, it caused outcry from some Catholic groups. It seems it's still a touchy topic for some parents and teachers today, though Timote says negative reactions remain a minority. Today, he's holding a discussion with some of his pupils.
We only live once. I won't hide it. I'm LGBT too. It's weird.
Pourquoi tu pleures?
Et c'est bien que tu l'assumes.
Oui.
Ça fait du bien parce qu'on se dit on n'est pas seul.
It feels good because you realize that you are not alone. So it's easier to accept yourself.
Ça permet d'assumer plus facilement, ouais.
He says his presence on TikTok, a network overwhelmingly used by teenagers, helps build trust.
I had a pupil who came to see me who asked my advice. So I encouraged him to first of all talk to his friends, because I know that sometimes it's not always easy with family. And I think that school needs to be the place where we feel most at ease. Then there was a pupil who came to see me and said, "Thank you."
Timote says when he started out 5 years ago, these subjects were barely touched upon in sex education, but he's now seeing promising progress. He's also working on a project with local NGOs aimed at tackling discrimination at school.
That's all for this week's France in Focus. Do catch us next time here on France 24.
They observe. They contact us. They report, film, photograph. They are the voice of the voiceless. Your eyes in the far-flung reaches of the world. The Observers, a network of 5,000 committed citizens working with France 24.
One of our observers in Côte d'Ivoire, Gaspard.
Amateur footage and testimonials checked by our journalists and broadcast weekly on The Observers, on France 24 and observers.france24.com.